This show is part of the Darkmoor Podcast Network.
To join our community Discord or see more content from our members, visit darkmoorpodcasts.com.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Dragon Mind, the TTRPG podcast where we discover our best selves through gaming. It has been a few months since the last Dragon Mind episode, but that doesn't mean that I've stopped podcasting. If you still want to hear from me weekly, you can check out the Untitled TTRPG podcast I do with Rel over on his YouTube channel and on Spotify. And if you have any questions or want to contact me, you can do so in the Dragon Mind discussion channel in the Darkmoor Podcast community Discord, or email at dragonmindpodcast@gmail.com, all linked in the description below. At the time of this recording, we are a little over a week away from the general release of the D&D 2024 Player's Handbook, a backwards-compatible update to 5th edition's core rules, including updated classes, subclasses, spells, and feats. While there is some new content, quote-unquote, like the College of Dance Bard and the Circle of Sea Druid, a lot of the content advertised as new was actually just originally released in Tasha's Cauldron of Everything, and has just graduated to being considered core to the game, as opposed to optional. Of course, in practice, any content in the PHB is quote-unquote optional, but I digress. In exciting news, D&D Beyond has released the 2024 version of the free rules, which includes all of the game's core systems, as well as a handful of classes and species. So, to kick off our D&D 2024 Practical Possibilities coverage, we're taking a look at 2024's general rules, which I consider the sections playing the game, equipment, and spells. Character-specific options, like classes, species, and feats, are going to be in their own episodes. Before moving on, just one note of what Practical Possibilities is all about. When I see analysis of 5e content, a lot of it has to do with theory crafting. For example, what's the most powerful multi-class combo? What's the most powerful level 20 build? How would we tier rank all of the feats and spells? I think that this content is fun and useful. And I also think that at a casual table, not all of it is practical. Instead, Practical Possibilities is about how you'd actually see and use content at an actual table, whether or not you're casual or you're invested. So with that out of the way, let's dive into the 2024 general rules. So speaking as someone who's tinkered with creating a system based on the 5.1 SRD, the first thing I want to say is that the new rules are formatted beautifully. Wizards of the Coast has bragged about the quality of the physical book's graphical design, but even seeing the text laid out on a webpage, I can only imagine how good the actual book must be. About a year ago, Stephanie and I released an episode of Borrowing Brilliance examining Pathfinder 2nd edition. Although it wasn't a great fit for our particular group of players, one thing that both of us agreed on was that the organization and readability of the Pathfinder 2nd edition core rulebook was superior to the 2014 D&D PHB. Well, D&D may have come out ahead again. Right from the beginning of the first chapter, Playing the Game, the descriptions of the game's core elements are clean, concise, and well organized. The chapter opens with describing the roles of players and dungeon masters. For players, the 3 bullet points are make a character, team up, and venture forth, which not only describes the general feeling tone of being a player, but also maps out the general structure of how D&D sessions progress. For DMs, the 3 bullet points are just as simple. Build adventures, guide the story, and adjudicate the rules. Again, I've taken a whack at writing descriptions of these core concepts with new players in mind. And I've been told that, in general, at the table, I do a good job of introducing new players to the game. And I'm really impressed by how accessible this text makes the concept of playing a TTRPG. That being said, let's just take a moment to appreciate that the first chapter of the Player's Handbook is actually just about playing the game. I can't tell you how frustrating it was as a new 5e player to be thrust right into character creation with no context of how any of my features interacted with the rules, especially after discovering that my first DM tended to adjudicate rules as written. I had no concept of what a bonus action was, or how to judge how strong a feature was. Imagining myself as a new player looking through this material in this order instead, I can imagine that it's much easier to confidently create a character for the first time and have a better idea of what to expect. Remember, all frustration is based on unmet expectations. Another highlight I want to point out, session structure is addressed as the second major concept right after establishing the roles of players and dungeon masters. As time goes on, I'm becoming a more and more fervent advocate that for TTRPGs, real-world time is one of, if not the biggest factor in whether or not a session is going to be enjoyable. I used to get extremely frustrated playing 2-hour weekly games that would pause in the middle and pick up next time, mostly because it wouldn't feel like we would meaningfully progress enough to make each session feel worth it. In contrast, I now run my sessions as 5-hour closed loops, meaning that even if there is some multi-session arc, each session closes with a distinct chapter close, and at the end of each one, it's easy to measure how much got done in the story. Rather than allowing myself to just kind of go on until it ends, I prep for the time that I'm given. If I promise 5 hours, we'll end within 5 hours, even if it means that I end up cutting content that I've prepared to do so. Even though there isn't any recommendation of why one would pick one session structure over another, which I do hope will appear in November's Dungeon Master's Guide, it's at least somewhat encouraging to see recognition that session structure is important enough to understanding TTRPGs that it's included this early on in the free rules. Scrolling down through the dice and ability score sections, we see the continued trend of improved visual organization. For example, in SRD 5.1, there's mention that an ability score of 10 is the human average, with 20 being the max, and some monsters having scores as high as 30. Although the table in the corresponding section of 2024 doesn't really have new information, it relays the same information in a more accessible way. By the way, when I say accessible, please don't mistake that for me meaning it's dumbed down. While there may be instances where those two circles of the Venn diagram overlap, accessible to me means that it's easier for more people to understand, especially at the table live. As a GM running a game live, looking up something in the book often feels like there's a time limit and you're under pressure, so you feel rushed to find information. Things like the table for ability score descriptions are easier to find or access the information quickly. It's just interesting because it also reminds me of a tool that Stephanie talked about in past episodes of Borrowing Brilliance, which is often used at our martial arts school when we autopsy some sort of conflict. There are 3 lenses we can look at it through: personnel, personnel, and process. What could I have done differently? What could they have done differently? And what were the breakdowns in the system that created confusion? When we make adjustments, we start with analyzing the system to determine if there's some kind of adjustment to the process that can prevent future issues. After all, people may come and go, but design creates sustainability. It's why our martial arts school has thrived for over 30 years through 3 generations of leadership, and we're still refining our systems to set up success for a 4th. It's all too easy to get stuck blaming issues on personnel. For example, you may read, it's the GM's fault for not leading effectively. It's the player's fault for not understanding their character's abilities. And there is often truth in these statements, and in my experience, ultimately they aren't helpful when looking at a problem through a growth mindset. Rather than get stuck at statements, how can we turn them into questions? For example, when is it a good time to give my GM some critical feedback that would help improve the experience? How should I approach them so it'll be easy for them to listen to me? What are they doing well that I can point out so they can use that criticism as a way to highlight their strengths? Why are these players failing to understand their characters? Is it the format of the character sheet? Is there too much information they're trying to learn too quickly? Could it be explained in a way that's easier for them to understand? Forgive me for my tangent, but it's the reason why I love the 2024 PHB rules and why they start with playing the game. It starts with the foundational agreements and systems that help players learn what's important in the game so that they have more access to the information that will help them be more successful. That isn't to say that personal and personnel don't have their part to play in creating a successful experience. It's just that design is what creates sustainability. And if something isn't going right, there may be a flaw in the design to look at. That being said, to use a metaphor, it doesn't matter how well designed a car is if the driver behind the wheel is being reckless. But I digress. The formatting of D&D 2024 is much better than 2014. So, rules-wise, what has actually changed? First, the 3 major D20 rolls, ability checks, attack rolls, and saving throws, have been just grouped together under the umbrella term D20 test. This way, if some sort of effect applies to all 3, the designers have a shorthand to describe it. For example, you may see an effect that says, all D20 tests have advantage until the end of your turn. Again, it's kind of a formatting thing, but technically it's new terminology to 2024. Inspiration from 2014 has been reworked into heroic inspiration. It no longer grants advantage, but rather allows a player to spend it to reroll any die. For example, if you rolled poorly on damage, you can reroll one of your damage die. To be frank, though, the best times to use it would still just to reroll a D20 test. Probably saving throws, because failing those will have the most debilitating effects. Maybe an attack roll I can see if you're trying to deliver a single powerful effect, like sneak attack or one of the new hated divine smites. But one thing clarified in the rules is that you can only reroll 1 die. So, for example, if you roll an attack with advantage and both dice roll low, you can only re-roll one of them to try to hit your target. This also means if you roll damage for a spell like Fireball, where you're rolling a whole bunch of damage die, and you roll really low, you would only be able to re-roll one of the 8d6s, which is not advisable. The other big difference between Heroic Inspiration and its 2014 version is that Heroic Inspiration actually appears in the system. So for example, humans automatically gain Heroic Inspiration after every long rest, which I think is kind of neat because it shows how human heroes end up being just a little more plucky. They can somehow get out of jams with sheer luck. So I'm probably missing some stuff, but the next change that stood out to me had to do with actions. Most of them are the same as 2014, like attack and disengage, but there are some new ones. From the playtest, the magic action has made it to the list, and the value of it is it just clearly delineates which effects are magical and which aren't. There are quite a few monsters in at least the 2014 Monster Manual that had the magic resistance feature, which just granted advantage on saving throws against magical effects. Well, it used to be a pain for players to determine if an effect was magical or not. Some effects, like the Aberrant Sorcerer's Warping Implosion, didn't say it was magical, so a creature wouldn't get a save on it. It was described as supernatural, which is so different than magical. Whereas something like the Light Cleric's Radiance of Dawn was a magical effect because it was a channel divinity. And even though it didn't say it was a magical effect in the feature, if you went back to the channel divinity section, it said channel divinities create magical effects. So it was kind of like putting up the red yarn to try to investigate if something was considered magical or not. Again, just to see if the monster had advantage on their save. Because a lot of these effects clearly say, as a magic action, do a thing, it's now easier to be able to tell whether or not an effect is magical. Before I forget, one thing that did change with the attack action is that now unarmed strikes are different. Rather than grappling and shoving being considered special attacks or whatever they were in 2014, now when you make an unarmed strike, you choose whether you're going to deal damage, grapple, or shove. And grapple and shove are no longer contested checks, they're saving throws, which makes monks by extension really neat because 2024 monks get all these unarmed strikes, so they can grapple, shove, and damage very versatilely. But speaking of new actions, we now have influence, search, and study. And at the end of the day, they really just clarify that using a check to change the circumstances of a combat requires an action. And I get why these three actions were formalized in the core rules. Personally, I've never run into balance issues letting players just roll a free check, kind of like how they get a free object interaction. Forcing them to give up their action to roll a perception check to search for an enemy felt overly punishing. What makes it harder now is that there are feats like Observant and Keen Mind, which turn some of these actions into bonus actions. So I might play rules as written, but more likely, if I were to start playing 2024, if a player was interested in using search or study, what I would tell them is we're just going to mush Observant and Keen Mind together. You get one of the little ASI bumps, you get 2 expertises, and the search and study are free as they've always been. I'm actually curious if anyone out there has had any balance issues with this kind of thing. And if so, let me know some sort of testimonial. Hey! At the end of the action section, there's a sidebar called What Would My Character Do? I think this one is actually worth reading aloud. Ask yourself as you play, what would my character do? Playing a role involves some amount of getting into another person's head and understanding what motivates them and how those motivations translate into action. In D&D, those actions unfold against the backdrop of a fantastic world full of situations we can only imagine. How does your character react to those situations? This advice comes with one important caveat. Avoid character choices that ruin the fun of the other players and the DM. Choose actions that delight you and your friends. I think this advice is brilliant. I've gotten into many debates over the years about the whole what would my character do? Well, based on my character's motivations, they wouldn't take an optimal strategy. And I can understand that, but whether or not it's enjoyable really comes down to just the dynamics of the real world people at the table. I've seen comments online from people like, oh, you should really truly roleplay your character. Meaning that if they don't attack and instead they dodge because they're cowardly, that's what your character would do. That's an interesting story. And that's fine, but some players just want to play the tactical combat game, even if it's broken. They want to roll attacks and cast spells and damage things. And so really what can happen is there can be a lot of conflict at a table if the expectations, again, back to expectations, are mismatched. If 3 of the 4 players want to play the combat game and one player wants to do some sort of Shakespearean tragedy, well, there's going to be frustration in at least one direction, probably both. So rather than try to force what you want, just paying attention to the vibe of the group can go a long way. And it usually doesn't have to be, I don't get my way and they get theirs. When you work with other people, sometimes there is a negotiation and compromises when it comes to creating the best experience for everyone. Speaking of socializing, the social interaction and exploration sections are 2 that I've seen a decent number of community members ask to be expanded. And in 2024, they've actually been condensed. Now, one thing I do think is a little weird, and I don't know if this is just the D&D Beyond version or if the physical book is formatted this way, but what made me laugh was both the special senses and hazard subsections are just a list of terms that you're supposed to reference in the rules glossary. For an online tool like D&D Beyond, it makes sense. You just take your mouse and hover over the term, say, tremor sense, and the definition just kind of pops up. But when it comes to the physical book, I'm not sure this is the same amount of usefulness. I've heard positive reception about the rules glossary and how helpful it is in the physical product. But having the physical book, going to special senses, and having the section just say, look it up in the rules glossary, to me seems, I don't know. It seems like you're making me jump around the book a little bit too much, rather than just printing the same definition twice. But again, I've never published a book. I don't really know what goes into it. It just seems a little bit odd if that is the case. But overall, I don't actually mind social interaction and exploration being condensed. I actually find that for the more role-playing pillars of play, when there's less rules, it's actually easier because there's less room for my players to get stuck thinking that those modes have procedures that they're supposed to follow. So, for example, social interaction pretty much just defines the 3 moods of NPCs. Those are like the only real mechanics that are mentioned. And exploration includes rules for things like vision, obscurement, and hazards. And I think that those little rules are fine enough tools for DMs to create some interesting situations without being so elaborate that they're hard to reference at the table. And also, the rules for breaking objects has been moved from the DMG into the player's handbook, which I think is ultimately a good move. Now, the meatiest pillar of play, combat, has also been significantly condensed. There were some rules removed, like I don't remember where squeezing came in, but there's no more specific rules for trying to squeeze your character through a small space. It just follows the same clean format that everything else has so far. One of the most universally praised changes was to surprise, which now merely means that a creature has disadvantage on initiative checks, as opposed to being confused if there's a surprise round or if surprise is this weird pseudo condition. I think it's a change that's indicative of most of the changes to the core rules. The game is much more streamlined and easier to implement practically at a table. The other change that stood out to me is that underwater combat used to have certain weapons that could negate the disadvantage to weapon attacks, like javelins and spears, but now any weapon that deals piercing damage works in underwater combat. Lastly, for the playing the game chapter, we have conditions. Thankfully, invisible has been updated so that if you're an invisible creature and a target can see you, like with see invisibility or true sight, you don't have advantage on your attacks as if you're unseen. Now, one thing that we playtesters panicked about early on in the playtest is that there was this cool new playtest version of Exhaustion, where instead of having 6 levels of cumulatively worse effects that were all different and difficult to remember, there were 10 levels, and for each level of Exhaustion, you would get a -1 penalty to all D20 tests. However, after a few packets, that playtest version just was subtly removed without it being talked about. So a lot of community members like myself, who really liked the new version of Exhaustion, kind of had this feeling we weren't going to see any sort of update. Thankfully, that isn't the case. Exhaustion still has 6 levels, but each level imposes a -2 penalty to D20 tests. It's pretty punishing, but it's at least practical to implement, and so I can see myself actually using it more at the table. So moving on to the equipment chapter, there are a few standout things I do want to mention here. First, the biggest addition is Weapon Mastery. As I've said previously, Weapon Mastery, to me, is a great idea with mostly good implementation. The weapons-wielding classes, like Fighter, Barbarian, Rogue, Ranger, Paladin, get Weapon Mastery at level 1. While other classes, if you're just single classing, can get it as part of a 4th level feat. A character with Weapon Mastery in a weapon gains an additional effect they can use, like reducing a target's speed, pushing someone, or knocking them prone. Most of them I like: Push, Sap, Slow, and Vex. I've seen criticism on the math around Cleave and Graze, with Cleave being a bit underpowered and Graze being a bit overpowered. But really the ones I don't like are Nick and Topple. Topple, I think, is easier to rag on. Each time you hit a creature, you can force it to make a save to avoid being knocked prone. The issue is that this apparently creates a significant slowdown for resolving the toppling player's turn, especially if they're playing a fighter that has more than 2 attacks, along with the potential to action surge. Prone is a relatively nasty condition to inflict, much more than simply granting advantage to the next attack like Vex. I personally can see a simple solution being that if a creature succeeds its save, it's immune to topple until the beginning of that player's next turn. That way, you can still have the chance to topple the creature, but you roll the save once and resolve it and move on. Now, the one that I think I'm going to be a little more alone on is Nick, and I've had a problem with Nick ever since I first saw it in the first Weapon Mastery playtest. The ability is simple enough. When you make the extra attack of the light property, you can make it as part of the attack action instead of as a bonus action. You can make this extra attack only once per turn. Now, first, I do have some sort of mechanical confusion. Recently, there was an interview with Jeremy Crawford and Todd Kenrick that suggested that after using the Nick property, you can go back and also use the light property bonus action attack. Whereas again, when I read it, it made it sound like you're just including the extra attack as part of the attack action instead of the bonus action. Meaning that the bonus action isn't still available, you're just kind of converting it and rolling it into the attack action. And this is how I plan to rule it at my table. I think the additional attack is a good enough benefit. Allowing 3 attacks at level 1 seems like a bit much. Now, mechanics aside, thematically my problem with Nick is that it's a mastery property as opposed to a fighting style. Again, I've taught martial arts for over a decade. 2-weapon fighting in the real world is not easy. There are some weapons that are lighter that lend themselves to 2-weapon fighting. And those weapons do tend to allow you to hit faster, meaning you can do more attacks in the same amount of time as a different weapon. Just something about Nick being tied to 2-weapon fighting is, I think, the thing that kind of bugs me. Mechanically, I think that the additional attack should just be tied to the weapon itself. If you've got a little dagger, it's small, it's easy to move, you can hit with it more often than a bigger weapon. It can be enhanced with a 2-weapon fighting style, where you've got a dagger in each hand, but I don't think the dagger by itself requires a second dagger in order for you to make the most of it. Again, it's just enhanced by having 2 of them. I'm already seeing these build theory crafting videos where, say, you have a hand axe in one hand and a scimitar in the other, so that way you can use the Nick property, but then the second weapon gets to trigger its mastery property. So I'm reducing a little bit of the build diversity by suggesting this, but from my real world experience and thinking through a mechanics design perspective, I just prefer that Nick be some sort of separate fighting style, maybe rolled into 2-weapon fighting, and just giving the weapons with the Nick property something like Vex or Sap. Anyways, further down in the equipment section, there are actually crafting rules in 5e. They're not comprehensive or particularly deep, and I don't think they have to be. All they do is actually give you a reason to have tool proficiencies. This isn't going to revolutionize or break gameplay, but I do love that Cartographer's Tools allows you to actually create a map, which mechanically grants you a +5 bonus to survival checks in the region that the map is drawn in. Now again, like I said earlier, the exploration rules have been condensed even more than they actually were, but having this map as an option is a great example of how there is this shift in design philosophy with 5e, where the engine is really simple, but you can start adding in little parts that deepen the gameplay. For example, this map is a piece of equipment, but it's an option that can reward players in the exploration pillar that's normally really simple. Also, you can get a gaming set that gives you a set of dice, so you can play Dungeons & Dragons inside your game of Dungeons & Dragons. You know, create a simulation inside of a simulation. Which brings me to the last section I really wanted to cover as part of these general rules: spells. Spells have changed in some subtle ways. So, for example, I'm pretty sure everyone is now a prepared caster, meaning that some classes can now switch their spells more easily than they used to be able to. It's a little quality of life improvement that just helps the game be more enjoyable. In addition, all spellcasters are now ritual casters, meaning that you no longer need to remember who can use a spell for free and who can't. The biggest change I like has to do with a little rule called one spell with a spell slot per turn. Now, previously, this restriction had to do with bonus actions. Bonus action spells had this annoying caveat that you can't cast a non-cantrip spell with your action the same turn you cast a bonus action spell, which would end up with some really stupid situations. For example, in 2014, if you were doing a Sorcerer Warlock multiclass, rules as written, you could quicken Fireball to a bonus action, and then use Eldritch Blast as your action. But you couldn't use Fireball as your action and quicken Eldritch Blast to the bonus action. Now, it's just one spell slot per turn. Easy to remember, easy to implement, interesting to circumnavigate. For example, some species in 2014 allow you to cast spells without a spell slot, meaning you can combo certain spells you wouldn't normally be able to. An example I've already seen is if you have a feature that allows you to cast Misty Step without a spell slot, you can teleport and then use a spell slot right after. Now, to circle the criticisms, I've already mentioned some of them, like how I don't think Influence and Study and Search need to be actions, or the Nick Mastery property. Overall, in the general rules, content creator Treant Monk has talked about spell components, how I guess they really needed to be adjusted because if you're tracking spell components, 2014 rules are clunky and they got no edits for the 2024 version. I tend to hand wave them anyway, so I don't see it as a really big deal. The biggest gap I see has actually to do with the fact that there's no explanation regarding session zeros or safety tools like lines and veils. These are concepts that I remember reading in Von Richten's Guide to Ravenloft and Tasha's Cauldron of Everything. And I can see the rationale of choosing to include it in the Dungeon Master's Guide, as the DM is most likely going to be the one to organize a session zero and keep track of lines and veils. However, like with the section, what would your character would do, I think it does a lot of good to educate players on how to be responsible when making certain game choices. To me, everyone at the table is responsible for making the experience as positive as possible. Yes, the DM ends up doing way more work, but I've been at tables where the DM is DMing awesome, most of the players are playing awesome, and there's one player that's either being a jerk or being disruptive, or is somehow behaving in a way that's making the experience not as good as it could be. And so even with the understanding that there is an asymmetrical power and responsibility dynamic leaning toward the DM, I do think that the best games I've run were the result of players taking accountability for their own behaviors and their own choices. Again, the system can only work as well as the personnel and the personnel that are operating within it. Overall, when it comes to the general rules, the engine of 2024, I think the system is pretty solid. It feels much more streamlined and accessible than 2014, and I'm excited to hear if games run smoother because of it. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode. Dragonmind is a proud member of the Darkmoor Podcast Network. To discover more TTRPG content like this, visit darkmoorpodcasts.com. If you had any insights or questions, be sure to email us at dragonmindpodcast@gmail.com or post in our discussion channel in the Darkmoor Podcast community Discord, linked in the description below. Our theme song, J-Pop, is brought to you by Theslian Studios. You can check out more of their awesome work at theslianstudios.com. Have an awesome day, and remember, your story matters. Bye-bye now.
Well, Grimton, Morlinde and Ulrich are gone. We're in a new, unfamiliar land of Kolgafir. What's our first move?
Polaris, I'm not too certain, but I did hear Fishbelly talking about something.
Oh, yeah. With the Warlord's half-sister in a meeting.
Yeah, that's about the only lead we have so far. We haven't been here long. Might be worth checking out.
Seems like a plan to me.
Join us as our party explores an unforgiving region of the Cusp and allies with new party members in Arc 3 of Advantage, a 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons audio drama focused on storytelling and character development, in the Darkmoor Podcast Network. Find us in your podcast app.